Come on.
Hey,
Come on. You just need to cooperate with me, all right?
I
want my dad.
Huh?
I want my dad.
What happened? What's going on? What's going on? All right, stop. I'll tell you what, can you sit on the ground here real quick? Come on.
You said the ground.
Yeah, you're fine right there.
No.
You're fine right there.
I grabbed the knife.
Before the Britain Street, exit ramp. A truck crossed, so...
She's got cuts on her hands. I don't know what they have in there, but there's a female down in there. Yeah.
What's going on?
I don't know. We just got...
I'm the dad.
Okay,
Sidney. I don't know.
Okay.
I don't know.
Daddy.
What? What the hell? Where's my wife?
The window's broken, Dad.
Where?
The back window's...
19-year-old Sidney Powell had her entire life ahead of her. An honours student and star athlete in high school, she'd earned a scholarship to college near her hometown in Ohio. Then, in March 2020, Sidney bludgeoned and stabbed her mother Brenda over 30 times, killing the woman who had loved and supported her. Sidney's path from a promising student to a murderous daughter was paved by a web of lies to hide her failures in school. Her inability to admit the truth led to unspeakable violence once her secrets were at risk of being exposed. Welcome to Grim Riddle's Crime Stories. As always, viewer discretion is advised. We share the story of Sidney Powell with deep respect and sensitivity to honour Brenda Powell's memory and create awareness for the issues raised. We would also like to highlight the importance of privacy and support for grieving families. If you or anyone you know is struggling with any of the issues raised in this video, please speak to someone and ask for help. Sidney Powell's life story looked like a success. She thrived in academics and sport at St. Vincent High School in Akron, Ohio, where she played soccer and lacrosse and served as team captain, earned a spot on student leadership committees, and graduated with an impressive 3.8 GPA. Sidney's well-rounded high school career reflected her diversity of interests. She participated in leadership committees and student government. These activities allowed Sidney to get to know many classmates from all different circles, and she was considered a popular person. Yet, Sidney remained humble, known as a shy, sweet girl who worked intensely and focused on her studies. Her quiet drive paved Sidney's path to success.
What kind of student was she?
She was a good student, so she had a high GPA. She cared about her grades. She did her work. She was conscientious. She was quiet. She was respectful, and had a lot of friends, and was a well-liked student, well-liked person, respected by the faculty.
Was Sidney ever, to your knowledge, in trouble for fighting or arguing?
No, she was not to my knowledge.
Was she ever that kind of kid who was causing trouble, arguing with other students, causing drama, anything like that?
No, never.
Though goal-oriented about her pursuits, Sidney still made time for close family relationships. She shared an especially tight bond with her mother, Brenda Powell. The two loved spending hours in conversation about Sidney's big dreams or the smallest everyday details. In the Powell household, academic ambitions never overrode nurturing mother-daughter intimacy. Sidney entered young adulthood with Brenda's steadfast emotional support in her corner. When it came for college, the family selected nearby Mount Union University, just an hour from their Akron, Ohio home. Sidney could ease into independence while still being close enough to regularly visit her tight-knit family. With good grades also came a merit scholarship, which helped fund her studies. Sidney moved onto campus in August 2018, energetic, prepared, and hopeful for what college would bring. However, months into her freshman year, Sidney confided in friends that she was struggling at Mount Union. Formerly laser-focused, Sidney began oversleeping and missing classes. She became anxious over her general education requirements, unsure of what career direction to take. Sidney put enormous pressure on herself to maintain the top grades she had previously attained. Despite confiding to friends briefly about feeling overwhelmed, Sidney kept the extent of her issues private, even as her GPA plummeted during that first year. Her sophomore year brought even worse troubles. Sidney failed 3 classes in the fall 2019 term and was notified she had been suspended for her poor academics. After a lifetime of success through hard work, Sidney faced her first true failure. But instead of admitting what happened and seeking help, Sidney was overcome by shame and fear. She made the fateful choice to hide her suspension and pretend that nothing was wrong. When students are suspended at Mount Union, they cannot live in campus housing or attend classes. However, after packing up her dorm room, Sidney turned right back around days later. She simply walked back into her residence hall and past campus security like it was just another new semester. Sidney lied to everyone that she was still actively enrolled. Her roommate Lauren, friends back home, professors and advisors, and even her family who were paying tuition. Sidney was terrified at the prospect of people finding out about her failure and suspension. She came from a successful family who valued education, and she worried that she ruined her image as the intelligent, high-achieving daughter who her family took pride in. Unable to face the truth, Sidney decided to hide it from the world. For months she lived a double life, acting as if everything was normal and that she was still a Mount Union student. Sidney lied to cover her tracks when she had to leave campus for days at a time. She claimed online classes from home due to the coronavirus pandemic sweeping America that January. To friends, Sidney insisted her disappearance merely coincided with short breaks between difficult classes that term. She spun detailed excuses so no one would uncover the deception or true status as an enrolled student barred from dorms. The web of deception kept growing to perpetuate Sidney's facade. For 2 months, Sidney managed to hide her suspension and eviction from campus housing, but keeping up the charade grew increasingly difficult. Since Sidney could no longer live in the dorms as an unenrolled student, she began secretly paying hotels for places to stay whenever she visited campus to see friends. Sidney wanted classmates to believe her lies that she was still actively attending Mount Union. The hotel stays allowed Sidney to hide from her parents that she was no longer enrolled or dorming at college. She used her savings, which wouldn't last for long. By March, facing grim financial realities with college tuition payments also looming, Sidney realized keeping up this facade was ultimately unsustainable. She snuck back into her parents' home in Akron, hoping they wouldn't find out the truth. Unfortunately, her frequent unexplained presence around the house soon raised questions. Sidney's parents, Steve and Brenda, grew puzzled, noticing they kept stumbling into their daughter casually snacking in the kitchen or being in her bedroom far more than her supposed busy class schedule should allow. Tension mounted rapidly.
I looked at a lot of the contents of her phone. A lot of it appeared to be just normal conversation with her mother, her best friend, Lauren, and it appeared to be just normal chatting. However, having reviewed what was going on with her at the University of Mount Union, that she was no longer a student there. You could tell by a lot of the messages that she had not told her family, that her mom wasn't aware of this because, for example, her mom was texting her about her classes in the spring semester, and she was replying, giving her answers about why she was in class, why she wasn't in class, and it was clear she wasn't being honest with her mother about the status, of being at Mount Union. Most of the text involving her friend seemed to be normal 18-year-old texts about movies, restaurants.
On March the 3rd, 2020, her father Steve was reviewing payments related to Sidney's college tuition when he made an alarming discovery. Sidney's access credentials to log into Mount Union's system had been revoked. When questioned, Sidney insisted nothing was amiss except minor website errors that she would handle. But Steve remained skeptical and prodded further. Still unwilling to confess, Sidney continued fabricating stories to downplay alarms. Only after Steve directly spoke with school administrators himself, confirming Sidney's inactive status, did she finally realize that she had nowhere left to hide and the truth would need to be revealed. When confronted finally with proof about her lies, Sidney broke down and confessed everything to her dad. She admitted failing classes and that the school suspended her back in December. According to Steve, Sidney expressed feeling inadequate compared to high-achieving friends and that she had a sense of disappointment because she couldn't identify a future career path. He reassuringly told her they would figure it out together and suggested calling her mother Brenda, who was better in emotional situations. Brenda immediately left work to come home after speaking briefly to Steve. As a child life specialist, she regularly comforted scared young patients and had always shared an incredibly close bond with Sidney. Tragically, Brenda would be brutally killed within the hour before ever getting the chance to help Sidney. Around 12:45 p.m., Brenda called Mount Union's administrative offices, trying to gain clarity into what was unfolding with her distressed daughter. It was this fateful call that captured audio of an apparent attack. Associate Dean of Students Michelle Gaffney and Dean of Students John Frazier were in Frazier's office returning Brenda's call when the unimaginable happened. The conversation had only just started, with quick introductions, when suddenly multiple loud pounding noises, followed by frantic screams, rang out through the phone. Horrified, Gaffney and Frazier shouted, "Brenda!" But the connection went dead.
On the phone message that we were given, and Dean Frazier was sitting at his desk, and I was sitting next to it. He dialed. The phone was answered, and Mrs. Powell answered.
You say Mrs. Powell, is that Brenda who answered?
Brenda answered, yes.
Okay. And what did you tell Brenda at that time?
So Dean Frazier was speaking and simply said, Brenda, this is Dean Frazier. I'm sitting here with Michelle Gaffney, our Associate Dean of Students. We're returning your call, and that's about as far as we got.
Did Brenda respond to that introduction at all?
Yeah.
Okay,
yes.
what did she say?
I think he asked, "Is this Brenda Powell?"
Oh, okay.
And she said yes, and then he identified himself.
Okay. And Miss Gaffney, what happened next?
There was a very large or a very loud sort of thud sound, like a pounding or a thud, accompanied by a pretty loud scream, and the scream might have actually been first, and then the thud.
Okay.
As I think about it, and then there was sort of an expulsion. The other sound that I heard at that same time, or right after, was sort of an expulsion of air, like the air was knocked out of somebody.
Okay.
I'd always heard that expression of the air being knocked, having the wind knocked out of you, but I didn't. That's actually what it sounded like. And then several more repeated thuds. I don't know how to describe the sound.
No, and that's okay. And you and Mr. Frazier could hear this from the other end of the phone.
From the other, it was on speakerphone, right?
Okay.
Yeah.
Did you hear any communication during these thuds?
Just the screaming.
Calling back several times, a younger female voice answered, saying she was Brenda Powell. The administrators instantly realized it was actually Sidney impersonating her mum to them. By that point, 50-year-old Brenda lay motionless just rooms away. With no actual response from the real Brenda, the administrators quickly notified authorities of the disturbing sounds indicating a potential crime in progress. Around the same time, at 12:51 p.m., Sidney's father Steve received an ominous call from a detective friend alerting him to dispatching police units to Steve's home address. Steve desperately called both Sidney and Brenda's cell numbers, but neither answered. When he finally did manage to reach Sidney, she was hysterical over the phone, shouting and screaming about a break-in at their home and about her mother being attacked. Responding officers were met with a vision of nightmares upon entering the Powell family's suburban Ohio residence. The back entrance showed signs of forced entry, but troublingly, blood smears on the exterior glass indicated it was broken from the inside out after the violence occurred within. 19-year-old Sidney Powell met police at the front door, hysterically crying that her mother was bleeding badly after an intruder's attack. She kept screaming for help to aid her mum, Brenda.
Take her outside.
Come on. Come on.
Is she gonna be okay?
Come on.
I don't.
Come on. Come on. You just need to cooperate with me, all right?
I love my dad.
Huh?
I love my dad.
What happened?
As officers surveyed inside, the home's shocking carnage revealed a much darker truth. Blood-spattered walls, overturned furniture, and other signs of violent struggle indicated a fierce confrontation erupted in the master bedroom. There, police discovered the savaged body of 50-year-old Brenda Powell. She lay deceased on her back, with over 24 stab wounds concentrated around her head and neck. Cast-off blood patterns surrounding Brenda's corpse suggested a brutal, prolonged assault. Next to her head lay a bloody cast-iron skillet. Not far from her body was a large butcher's knife from Powell's kitchen, also coated in gore. The extent of blood loss and trauma made it clear this was no break-in by a stranger. It was an explosion of enraged mutilation against Brenda Powell by someone with intimate access to and knowledge of the household. Witnesses described Sidney as fluctuating between disassociated muttering and the loud frantic cries of an intruder harming them. But with the noted injuries on her hands and the window intentionally staged, implications for her own mother's murder emerged. In mere hours, investigators uncovered vile culpability hiding behind her stories. Sidney was arrested and charged with her own mother's murder. On September the 7th, 2021, Sidney's highly anticipated murder trial commenced after multiple delays. Observers packed the courtroom for over 2 weeks, dissecting the circumstances behind the horrific attack. Sidney faced 3 charges: purposeful murder of her mother, Brenda Powell, felonious assault causing Brenda's death, and tampering with evidence by staging the scene. She entered a plea of innocent by reason of legal insanity. Sidney's team called 3 expert forensic psychiatrist witnesses to argue she suffered acute schizophrenia that rendered her unaware that killing Brenda was morally wrong or criminal.
Even earlier, probably maybe even summer of 19, certainly during the fall of 19, she began to kind of cross the line from normal self-critical thoughts to significantly disordered thoughts, to psychotic thoughts, including highly critical auditory hallucinations. You're worthless, you're a failure, you don't deserve to live, those kinds of thoughts.
So those auditory hallucinations, were those reported to you by Ms. Powell?
They were reported to me as having occurred leading up to it, but again, the problem is when you are truly psychotic, generally you don't have a lot of awareness of it.
They testified that Sidney recalled only brief flashes of sitting with her mother and moving around the basement or upstairs, feeling compelled to flee. She remembered nothing else until waking handcuffed in a hospital, puzzled by her circumstances for being there. They also pointed out Sidney's lack of motive and uncharacteristic explosive violence as evidence that psychosis prompted the savage assault, given no prior behavioral issues. In response, prosecutors strategically dismantled the defense's claim that Sidney was in psychosis when she killed Brenda and thus legally insane. While conceding the attack's brutality indicated mental instability, the state maintained Sidney still understood her violent actions were immoral and illegal when she committed them. They contended that legal insanity requires absolute inability to determine right from wrong, a high bar but not fully substantiated regarding Sidney's mental diagnoses.
By the time she gets home, in my opinion, she is in the midst of a full-blown psychotic episode.
I do not agree with that assessment.
Why not?
Because there's no evidence to support that claim other than she said so. When we're trying to determine somebody's knowledge of wrongfulness, there's some classic things that we're paying attention to. So lying, concealing, avoiding detection, fleeing, and trying to implicate another perpetrator. Those would be some clear signs that somebody understands what they're doing is wrong.
Instead, the prosecution emphasized evidence indicating Sidney retained awareness and purposeful control despite her disorders. She demonstrated goal-orientated criminal thinking, trying to disguise the murder as a break-in, suggesting comprehension to evade the consequences of her actions from law enforcement. A friend testified that Sidney behaved normally in the past weeks, which contradicted the sudden onset of a personality-altering illness. And they also noted all examinations of Sidney's mind occurred after arrest, when facing intense pressure to appear psychotic, rather than partially beforehand. Ultimately, prosecutors argued these factors combined illustrated Sidney's strategically exaggerated psychiatric symptoms to manipulate the legal system, rather than legitimately meeting stringent insanity standards absolving murder liability. They implored the jurors to reject fabrication and uphold justice for Brenda's suffering.
I don't think we heard any evidence that Brenda would keep a steak knife in her bedroom. She had to switch weapons and keep attacking her. And when you're figuring out whether the murder was purposeful or felony murder, like Mr. McAleese was saying, please think about those injuries. Because I could see the frying pan just in a rage or snapped or whatever it was, but that knife just in the neck multiple times, that's purposeful. That is trying to end someone.
After 11 grueling days of dissecting arguments, evidence, and theories from both legal teams, the jury ultimately sided with the prosecutors. Sidney knowingly committed homicide, escaping from rational explanation.
Verdict form number 1 as to count 1 reads, "We, the jury in this case, being duly impaneled, sworn, and affirmed, do hereby find the defendant Sidney Powell guilty of the offense of murder as charged in count 1. The form goes on to say, and we do so render our verdict upon the concurrence of 12 members of said jury. Each of us said jurors concurring in said verdict signs their name hereto this 20th day of September 2023. Each juror has signed in ink next to his or her name." Verdict form number 2 reads, "We, the jury in this case, being duly impaneled, sworn, and affirmed, do hereby find the defendant Sidney Powell guilty of the offense of murder as charged in count 2. And we do so render our verdict upon the concurrence of 12 members of said jury. Each of us said jurors concurring in said verdict signs their name hereto this 20th day of September 2023. Each signed their name in ink next to their juror number." Verdict form number 3 reads, "We, the jury in this case, being duly impaneled, sworn, and affirmed, do hereby find the defendant Sidney Powell guilty of the offense of felonious assault as charged in count 3.
The prosecution testimony regarding her elaborate ruses for months at college illustrated Sidney's failure to think through consequences at times, being ruled more by irrational emotions than most. But regarding the actual violent killing itself, jurors felt witness accounts of Sidney's purposeful actions before, during, and in the immediate aftermath undercut pleading legal culpable insanity. Given automatic life sentencing applicable for murder, Sidney's final conviction hearing 8 days later focused mainly on whether periods served for the other charges would run concurrently or extend her incarceration further. Her attorney reiterated through tears Sidney's consistent remorse and mental rehabilitation, engaging in extensive therapy from jail. Her father, Stephen, requested lenience and forgiveness. Ultimately, though, the long trial left little uncertainty. Brenda suffered immensely, dying slowly alone in terror and pain from dozens of slashes and blows by the young woman she loved most.
Facts and circumstances of this case, and in consideration of the relevant sentencing factors, including seriousness and recidivism, and applying the minimum sanction that the court has determined will protect the public and punish the offender without imposing an unnecessary burden on state and local resources, the court imposes the following sentence. On count 1, ma'am, I sentence you to an indefinite sentence of 15 years to life in the Ohio Department of Corrections. On count 4 of the indictment, I sentence you to 3 years in the Ohio Department of Corrections. Those 2 sentences to be run concurrent with and not consecutive to each other. Ma'am, please understand that on count 4 of the indictment, you may be subject to a period of post-release control upon your release. And if you violate that post-release control, the Adult Parole Authority is authorized to return you to prison for up to 9 months for any single violation and up to 50% of your prison sentence for all violations. Please also understand that if you're placed on post-release control and you are convicted of a new felony, in addition to being punished for that new offense, the judge could add an additional consecutive 1-year period of time in prison, whichever is greater as a maximum. Ma'am, understand that you have a right to appeal this decision.
The tragic story of Sidney Powell leaves behind more questions than definitive answers. Legal experts debate whether justice truly got served, given conflicting views on her mental stability. Yet, regardless of varied opinions on trial verdict and sentencing, we cannot forget that the deepest loss belongs to Brenda Powell and survivors grieving her horrific death.